Good evening. On behalf of the entire Duke University community, I am delighted to welcome you to the David M. Rubenstein Distinguished Lecture, featuring the Honorable Madeleine Albright, the 64th Secretary of State of the United States. This is the second year of the Rubenstein Lecture Series, which was created by David Rubenstein, Trinity Class of 1970, to bring the foremost voices in American public policy to Duke. We are so very grateful to David for all he has done to advance dialogue on our campus. I also want to recognize Judith Kelley, Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy, which hosts the Rubenstein Lecture. In her first year at the helm of Sanford, Dean Kelley is ensuring that Duke remains on the cutting edge of social science and public policy research, advancing a legacy that dates back to the great Terry Sanford, namesake of the Sanford School. Now, as many of you know, Dean Kelley is a renowned political scientist and international relations scholar, and she researches how international actors can promote democratic and human rights, which makes her perfectly well suited to lead off tonight's program. And I will note that she will be moderating our brief question and answer period with Dr. Albright after the lecture. Tonight's event is also co-sponsored by the American Grand Strategy Program, which will also bring John Kelly and Andrew McCabe to Duke in the next few weeks. Sanford and AGS are redefining what policy education looks like for the 21st century, giving our students real-world immersive experiences that will equip them to be the next generation of leaders in public life. So thank you, Dean Kelley, American Grand Strategy Director Peter Fever, and all of your colleagues for leading the way. The title of this lecture series seems particularly fitting given tonight's distinguished guest. There are few public servants who are as distinguished as Secretary Madeleine Albright. Her career in government, international affairs, and the academy spans more than 4 decades, and she has broken new ground for women and advocated for marginalized populations at every turn. An exhaustive list of her accomplishments would take all night, so let me just cover the highlights. She began her career on President Carter's National Security Council and later moved to the Woodrow Wilson Institute of Peace and the Center for National Policy, where she worked to advance the cause of democracy in Eastern Europe and to define the U.S.'s role in the post-Soviet world. In 1993, President Clinton appointed her ambassador to the United Nations, where she served until 1997, when she became the first woman to serve as Secretary of State and the highest-ranking female official in United States history. And I would just guess that that's one milestone you might be delighted to see relinquished soon. As Secretary of State, Dr. Albright was a vocal advocate for human rights, fair trade, and diplomacy, causes that she continues to support as chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm that she co-founded. Secretary Albright also serves as a professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, chairs the National Democratic Institute, and is president of the Truman Scholarship Foundation. The most recent of her many books is Fascism, A Warning, which was published to critical acclaim last year. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Madeleine Albright to Duke.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, President Price, thank you so much for telling everybody who I am, because sometimes people don't know. And not long ago, I was coming back from from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry. And I was there getting undressed for the security people, and I put my stuff down on the conveyor belt, and the lady behind me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak." And I said, "Well, at the Container Store." And then I was going through the magnetometer, and the TSA guard looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, it's you." He said, "I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia. And if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia. And you're always welcome in Bosnia." And then he said, "Can I have my picture taken with you?" And I said, "Sure." And the whole line gets screwed up, and I go back, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, "So what exactly happened here?" And I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State." And she said, "Of Bosnia?" So, so thank you very much.
Little did we know this was going to be a sit-down comedy show. President Price, thank you for that introduction. Madam Secretary, we're delighted to have you here. And while, although, as Price has noted, you have written recently a famous book on fascism, A Warning, you have written an even more famous book, Read My Pins, Stories from a Diplomat's Jewel Box.
Yes.
So please share with us why you chose to wear the pin you chose to wear today.
Well, first I have to say how it all started, by the way. I clearly like jewelry, and I go to the United Nations, and it's right at the end of the Gulf War. And the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. And I was an instructed ambassador, and I had to make sure the sanctions stayed on. And so I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein every day. He deserved it. He'd invaded Kuwait. So all of a sudden, a poem appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things. But among them was an unparalleled serpent. So I decided to wear a snake pin whenever we talked about Iraq. And so then the press picked it up, and I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out, and I bought a lot of costume jewelry to depict whatever I thought was going to happen on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons. And on bad days, I wore carnivorous animals and spiders.
I'm starting to worry about what's going to happen today.
So, and the ambassadors began to notice it, and they'd say, "What are we going to do today?" And I said, "Read my pins." And that is how it started. So, I was trying to figure out what to wear. I don't have a blue devil, so I was trying to, so this is an eagle, and I like eagles in so many ways as a spirit of America. And then this morning, I read in the papers, it was really crazy, there is a bald eagle nest in Washington, D.C., and the eagle president, had flown away, and his wife, Liberty, was not very happy. Oh. Anyway, the eagle came back, and so I decided it made sense to wear the eagle for that reason, too.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. So we're here today to talk about the state of democracy. So can you share a little bit about how your own life story has influenced your own thinking and work on democracy?
Well, I am a naturalized American, as are you, and I think to be able to live in the world's greatest and oldest democracy is a great honor. And I have always thought about democracy. I come from Czechoslovakia. I was born there, and Czechoslovakia actually was a democracy in the interwar period. Mm-hmm. The Czechoslovak Constitution was a copy of the American ones. Woodrow Wilson was much beloved in Czechoslovakia, and Woodrow Wilson had married an American. He did something, if you can believe it, at the end of the 19th century, he took her maiden name as his middle name, which is very interesting. So Charlotte Gehrig, so Thomas Gehrig Masaryk. And the Constitution is a copy of the American one, except for one exception. In 1918, it had women's rights in it in 1918. Mm. And so I grew up with the whole idea of a functioning democracy. And then the Nazis came, and we'll talk more about that. And then later, the country was taken over by communism. And kind of trying to figure out what happened to that democracy, what were the various influences. And when we came to the United States in 1948, and my father came and he moved to Denver, and he taught at the University of Denver, and he said, there's nothing better than being a professor in a free country. But the thing that he said, which is always in my mind, he said, I'm not sure the Americans understand how fragile democracy is, and that they take it for granted too much. And so I've decided we never can take democracy for granted.
Certainly in today's world, there are plenty of signs that we should not do so. Democracy has been in decline 13 years in a row. Over the last 13 years, we've seen some 23 countries have some backsliding. Even though the backsliding is modest relative to the gains that were made in the 70s, many people now say we're in a democracy recession. So you've said that while democracy in the long run is the most stable form of government, in the short run, it is the most fragile. How does that statement fit in with how we think about the current backsliding that we're observing around the world?
Well, I think that democracy is under threat, and Freedom House keeps putting out these lists, and more countries are less viable democracies, frankly. And I think some of it has to do with generally things that are going on worldwide in terms of globalization and its downside of facelessness and loss of identity. The other, some has to do with technology, how people get their information, and a number of aspects of divisions in society where people have a sense that the social compact has been broken and that they are not really being treated fairly. I think one of the things, especially at a university and to students, is we all study what comes first, political development or economic development. They clearly they go together because democracy has to deliver. People want to vote and eat. And so the question is how they go together and what do the democracies really deliver. And the problem is that democracy, I think, takes an awful lot of work and a lot of time. And we talked about this a little earlier, and I just would like to repeat it, is that Arab Spring, for instance, people are motivated to go to Tahrir Square by social media. They get there, and I'm always the last person to say this, but the elections were held too soon. And the Muslim Brotherhood was organized, and the people in Tahrir Square had gotten there by social media. There were no political parties. They couldn't figure out what to do. They lose the election, and Cairo's a mess, and all kinds of terrible things are going on. And then I made up this kind of older guy who needs to go into Cairo to open his stall in the marketplace, and he sees this disorder, and he says, to hell with this, I want order, and now they have a military government. And so democracy takes quite a long time and building. It needs support from the inside and the outside, and people are nervous and tired, and they wonder where their life is going, and is there any equity in it? So I do think democracy is under threat. The part that I'm very sad about is that we're not the best example. So when I was in Egypt actually talking to some members of parliament, and I said the really important part about democracy is compromise and coalition building. And this one guy says to me, you mean like you guys? So at the moment, we are not the right model.
So yesterday, or maybe the day before yesterday, in a hearing on the Hill, you said that you apologized to Mitt Romney for a comment he had made in 2012. This was in 2012. You apologized for what you had said about him then, which was that he was overestimating the threat of Russia. So how worried are you now about countries like China and Russia and their influence on democracy around the world?
Well, let me just say, I think I was surprised when Mitt Romney said it was the greatest threat. I found very interesting as the intelligence agencies put out, and the national security strategy of the Trump administration puts China and Russia as the great threats. All of a sudden, given the kinds of things the Russians are doing to undermine democracy, I think they really are a threat. They have weaponized information, and the elections in Ukraine are about to happen, and they are the front line now in terms of how hacking and various things are going on in propaganda. And what has happened is, I think, that we forget, and that Putin is a KGB agent, and that basically he has played a weak hand very, very well. So when Romney was talking about Russia, what one saw was the weakness of everything, and yet Putin has figured out how to mobilize the people in order to get Russia's greatness back again. And so I think we do have to worry about it. The Chinese are doing something else, which is that they have dealt with raising huge numbers, more people out of poverty than any other country in the world. And they just say that they have that particular system going. They are doing something that they call One Belt, One Road, which is really expanding China's influence and supporting various more autocratic forms. I keep saying the Chinese must be getting very fat because the belt keeps getting larger and larger. And they have had influence not only in Central Asia, but the Middle East. And just as we've been looking at what's been happening in Venezuela, they have influence there. So they are using, both the Chinese and Russians, their national security tools in a different way and probing where the United States has stepped back.
In your book, Fascism, you talk about Mussolini and the plucking of a chicken. Explain a little bit about that statement and how that relates to what we're seeing today in the world.
Well, let me just say, I decided I wanted to write the book no matter who was elected, because I saw some of these fissures in society and where they were going, and then my own story of having been raised as a Czechoslovak and the fascists coming in. So I thought it was important to try to figure out what had happened. And again, at a university, one can make so clear research is really important. And I was fascinated by, as I learned more about Mussolini's history. The Italians were dissatisfied. They had actually been on the Allied side during World War I. They were not recognized enough for that. They felt that they had not been really appreciated enough. And then there also were a lot of economic problems. Mussolini was an outsider, a very clever man who knew how to speak and mobilize people. He came into power, and this is the part that I found interesting, constitutionally. King Emmanuel, who was weak, asked him to take over. And he took one step at a time, and the best quote in the book is about this, that if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. So I think there's a lot of feather plucking going on. By the way, you can't say those two words together too quickly. And so I was talking about that it's unnoticed, and therefore my book is Fascism, a Warning. And some people think it's alarming, and it's supposed to be alarming. In order to, what are the feathers? How does power accumulate? What does fascism really mean? And what is the loss of democracy as a result of that? So, and then the interesting part is Hitler also came to power constitutionally.
Right.
And then all the systems that I write about now, I have made, which are like Hungary and Turkey and the Philippines, Venezuela, that in fact all those governments were elected. And so the only, I think communists or fascists also, they had the revolutions, the Russians and the Chinese. But I think the warning here is that it's either constitutional or elected, and it's people who feel that their governments are not responsive to them, and a leader who comes along and instead of finding answers which bring people together, identifies with one group, whether it's tribal or ethnic or any kind of a group, and says, I'm with you, and those other people don't have any rights. And not only that, but they're responsible for all your problems. And that is the beginning of authoritarian government.
So let's shift a little bit to talk about democracy in the US, or the nature of democracy more generally, because we've talked about the leaders, but at the end of the day, democracy is about the people. And you talk in your book about how we've lost trust in institutions and the partisanship of US politics, but you quote the president of Czechoslovakia from a quote in 1918 where he said, "Democracy is not only a form of state. It's not just something that is embodied in a constitution. Democracy is a view of life. It requires a belief in human beings, in humanity. I have already said that democracy is a discussion, but the real discussion is possible only if people trust in each other and if they try fairly to find the truth." So my question to you is, have we lost trust in one another? And have we stopped trying fairly to find the truth? And if so, what does that mean for our democracy?
Well, I think that what has happened is I think we have to admit there are problems. There really are issues that came along as a result of technology and loss of jobs, and we can talk more about that. And there is a question about how to deal with it. And I think that they're not easy because there's so many different changes. By the way, I stole this line from Silicon Valley. It is plagiarized, but it explains things very well, which is that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. So they are not really responding to the problems that are out there. And then you find dissatisfaction and then somebody who undermines trust in the other group. And so what I think has to happen is for us again to sort out who we are. And I think we all have this saying, we know the saying, see something, say something. I have my to-do list, do something. My to-do list really is to call out when things are going wrong, when the press is called the enemy of the people or there's no respect for the judiciary and various aspects of really separating people in many ways. Then I think people need to become politically active, either run for office or support those that do. And then, and this goes to your very point, is we need to talk to people with whom we disagree. I don't like the word tolerance. That's tolerate, put up with. I want to know why people have different views and to have really civilized conversations and to then restore trust in terms of what people think. And then there isn't a book or speech that's ever given that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So I like one of his quote, which is, "The older I get, the younger are my teachers." And so I think we need to really empower the younger generation much more. For instance, those Parkland kids, which was a year ago, where they went out and marched and had town halls, and our students these days, in terms of developing that humanity, that trust in each other, and respect for the other one. And we don't do that enough, not to make the other one the scapegoat, but to respect the other one and figure out what we think.
So you mentioned technology, and in your book you also talk about how we've become so demanding of our governments, and we have quick information about whether or not they are performing, and that makes us impatient. And you say that we crave all the benefits, but none of the cost, and we don't ask ourselves what we can do, and then we are quick to jump to easy solutions. So how do you see that feeding into our attitude to politics these days?
Well, I think partially, again, I mentioned earlier about the social compact being broken. That came up because individuals gave up their rights, certain rights, in order to be protected by the state. And there are different levels of that. And what's happened is, at the moment, both sides have broken that contract. And the people, in many ways, I think it is not just a privilege to vote, it's a responsibility to vote and to really know what's going on and try to figure out how we can all contribute to solutions. And the governments need to recognize the fact that they are dependent on the people, that actually paying taxes is the price of living in a civilized society, and how infrastructure, any number of different things, and those pieces have broken down. I also think that we need to understand better what the private sector does, how people relate to each other, and then the part that I think is really hard, that we are living in a completely different era. Some of us are mostly 20th century, and there were systems that were worked out that don't work now. And I think that what we need to do is sort out what was good in the 20th century. I've just been involved in a project of a declaration of principles that kind of goes back to post-World War II, where we knew after a horrible war, we took all those for granted. I think that there's some value in renewing our vows, but also kind of looking at what works in the 21st century. And technology is a huge part of it, in terms of where do people get their information, how quickly do they expect the government to react. The government, it's easier to react if you're an authoritarian government. And yet we need to understand that the blessings of democracy is that it takes time and it takes people. You know, I know some people don't like the term populism. You need people for democracy. So I don't think we can just identify populism as bad. We need people to be involved. We need to trust each other, and it's going to take a lot of work. This is not going to happen overnight. And so I think it's a difficult period, there's no question. And the press is the lifeblood of a democracy. Information is power. We need to know what the press is doing, how they are not the enemy of the people, where do we get our information. So there's an awful lot of work to do. This is not going to happen by just listening. We all have to get out there and have our to-do lists.
Yes, that's another thing you talk about, is how we tend to look for quick solutions, and that Hitler himself even said that the reason he came to power was that he was able to present sort of simple solutions to problems. So do we look for the right qualities in our leaders today? And if we don't, is the system set up in such a way that we can do that? Or how does the system need to change so that we can look for the right qualities in our leaders?
You know, at the end of my book, I say, maybe we're not getting the right answers because we don't ask the right questions. And I do think one of the questions is, what kind of leaders do we want?
Right.
Are they leaders who respect what other people are saying? Are they leaders who understand the institutional structure? Are they leaders who respect the judicial side? I think we need to understand, ask ourselves better questions about the leaders, and not ones that have some simple answer. And it's very tempting. I mean, if something's not going wrong, somebody says, I have all the answers, and you think, okay, let him do it. By the way, it's usually hymns.
Time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But do you think that our electoral system is set up a way to produce the types of qualities? What qualities would you want to look for?
Well, I actually do think that voting, I mean, people need to understand that, as I said, is not just a privilege, but a responsibility. I think that we need to be better prepared for the elections, that people need to know what the issues are. By the way, I'm very glad that the presidential season has begun, because it may be, it's 2 years basically. The bottom line is that we need to have a large public discussion. We are in a very different kind of period. What are the answers? People need to talk to each other directly, small groups, but understand that if you don't vote, then it's difficult to criticize. The other part that I find hard to deal with, as an example of this country, and it's what you started out with, is basically that there's some of the systems, there's voter suppression, there's gerrymandering, any number of things we have to make clear. How to make our voting system better. And then we have to protect it, to go back to hacking and what the Russians and the Chinese and to some extent the North Koreans are doing to undermine the system. So I think we've taken an awful lot for granted. But ultimately, democracy is the people. We are not a direct democracy, we're a representative one. But I do think for that reason we need to ask what we want in our leaders and then not just kind of call and complain, but try to have much more of an interaction. I also do think the other thing that is true, I happen to have lived in Washington a long time, and I worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Muskie, and I worked in the White House. But I think that the local governments are the ones that are really trusted, and that the relationship has to begin there.
Yeah, you talk about elections, and somebody who's studied election monitoring and fraud and things like that, it was mind-boggling to live in North Carolina and have a district race that needs to be rerun. And we can be horrified about that, but the good news is it is going to be rerun. So the system worked, right? So let's shift a little bit to talk about democracy promotion, because that's something that's near and dear to your heart. And as chairman of the National Democratic Institute, you've traveled around the world and spoken out in favor of democracy and human rights. But we've had some very severe cuts to democracy promotion budget. Some of the decreases in attention democracy promotion started even earlier than this administration, but we're certainly seeing it more in this administration. In your view, is America now taking the right approach to democracy promotion, and what can we do better?
Well, let me just go back to some basics, which is I happen to believe that we're all the same, that people want to exist in a situation where they can make decisions about their own lives. And it begins in terms of where you live and what language you speak and where you want to send your children to school or whatever. And then it grows into wanting to have something to do with your neighborhood decision-making process, et cetera. And I got very fed up when I was in office. Then people would say, well, Asian values. Asians don't want human rights and democracy. Not true. And as a matter of fact, my assistant secretary for democracy and human rights was Harold Koh, who is a South Korean. And very specifically, we talked about this. So I do think we're all the same. Then the question is, how do you proceed to make this happen? And what is interesting is the things that I've been involved in actually began officially with Ronald Reagan, because what he did, he spoke at Westminster in London in '83 and said democracies were not real good about explaining themselves vis-a-vis communism. So he came back and he started the Endowment for Democracy that has a Democratic Institute and a Republican Institute and Business and Labor, kind of the warp and woof. I was the original vice chair of the Democratic Institute, and we truly did not know what to do. And we began to think about what did we have responsibilities to kind of explain democracy and then help other countries achieve it in some way. Now, you can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. But what you can do is help people get the nuts and bolts of democracy. So that is what NDI and IRI have been doing. And by the way, the most recent chairman of IRI was Senator McCain, and he and I did a lot of different things together. Now Senator Sullivan of Alaska is head of it. And I think Congressman Price just told me they were listening to Mark Green from USAID, who had been the president of IRI. So there is an organization that really is operating in terms of trying to develop how to help others get democracy. And it does require funding, and there are those who think that promoting democracy is a terrible idea. I disagree. Americans are safer if other countries are democracies, and then also we are helping other people be able to live the lives that they want. But it's not simple, and it's that patience part of it that we talked about earlier that is difficult. We were euphoric, I have to say, about Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall, and it's much harder than it looks. And so it's that difficulty, and it doesn't provide instant answers. It requires the work of the people to do it. And one of the interesting parts, you were saying North Carolina and voting over.
Right.
NDI has just had a big election observing operation in Nigeria. They postponed it, they've now come back, and there are a lot of kind of tools that have been developed, a parallel voting count in a number of ways, so that maybe you could use that here.
Parallel
kind of,
vote tabulation.
in terms of really making sure that people have the opportunity. By the way, in what I find, we were talking about Americans voting. Our voting population isn't very, I mean, there are plenty of people, but not the voters. People in other countries stand in lines in the rain or the heat for hours in order to have the privilege of voting. And so I really do think we'd have to do more small d democracy promotion in our own country and around the world in order to get the systems that are required. But there are various ways to do it.
So you were a harsh critic of Bush, and a lot of people after the Iraq War came to associate democracy promotion with this imposition, which, as you said, is an oxymoron. Is there anything, though, that Bush got right about democracy promotion? And as much as you think about, you were a strong supporter of Obama, was there something that he got wrong?
Well, I do think one of the things that happens, and it isn't just democracy, is that no president comes in with a clean slate. You have to pick up the pieces of what happened before. Partially, you have run a campaign opposed to what the other people did, but you do have the same story that you have to pick up. I can spend my whole time apologizing for things that I said, but President Bush, it's very interesting. I was invited to, by the way, let me go back on something that we established when I was in office, which was something called the community of democracy.
Yes, you did.
Which was a way for democracies to help each other with best practices.
It's not gone anywhere.
No, but there was a real attempt, and the definitions were who was going to help, what were the countries. We had our first meeting in Warsaw, and there really were plans to try to figure out more how to develop, and it exists. The point is that some of the issues in terms of the funding of the State Department have created a problem. So what did happen was President Bush invited what I call the former people into the White House when not long after he took office, and I was one of the people invited, and he was trying to explain what was going on in Iraq, and that Iraq was basically not just a military activity, but a democracy promotion activity. I think it actually hurt because it militarized democracy, and that's what I was criticizing. But President Bush comes in and sits down in this room outside the Oval Office and says, you know, I want you all to understand what we're doing, and I support democracy, and he kept going on like that, and then we started asking some questions, and then the meeting was over, and I'm walking with him, and he says to me, I'd like to show you how I redecorated the Oval Office, and I said, you know, Mr. President, I'm so glad you are supporting democracy, but you act as though you invented democracy when actually I did. And he did laugh, you know, but we have, I think he was trying to support democracy, but the bottom line, it did get identified with that. Then President Obama, I think, did not like the concept of nation building because that was some of the arguments for Afghanistan and Iraq. Nation building kind of became a four-letter word, and I think instead we should think about that what I said in the first place is that we do all want to be the same, have the rights, and how we can help each other through the tools, development assistance, and recognize that we're all better off if other people are not living under autocratic governments.
If it was just a choice between promote democracy or not, then that would be simple. But there's this tension sometimes between the goals we have, promoting stability sometimes, or promoting democracy. Is that a tension you think is a real tension? Do we have to make choices about supporting governments that keep things stable versus promoting democracy, or is that not a real tension, and are we making the right choice?
Well, I think the hardest part, I have to say, as a practitioner and a professor, is to say that we have I think it's important, our value system, but that sometimes foreign policy is inconsistent, that you have to be pragmatic. By the way, I think the argument always as to whether our foreign policy is idealistic or realistic is a false dichotomy. And the reason I said that is because I never knew whether I was an idealistic realist or a realistic idealist. And I've decided you need both. And the way to describe it is like a hot air balloon. You need the idealism to get the balloon up and the realism of the ballast to get it in a direction. And you need both. Mm-hmm. But you don't have, I don't think, the kind of luxury of deciding you're not going to deal with any government or some government. I think there wasn't a time that I went to China that I raised human rights every single time. And I think it's up to the Americans to do that. But there are times you have to work with them on something that you don't like. And so that's the statecraft, is trying to figure out when you do what when. So idealistic realism is the way that I look at things. So I don't think we need to make a false dichotomy out of it.
So speaking of statecraft, you've been busy on the Hill lately, and not only were you on the Hill the day before yesterday, but also yesterday. And yesterday you testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and you said, "Today the enemies of freedom smell something in the air that gives them hope. The odor of America's absence and the impression that our leader shares their disdain for democracy." So can the U.S. claim this leadership role in democracy now, or reclaim it?
Well, let me say this. I am a very grateful American. As somebody that was a refugee and came here and ended up with a pretty good job. And I was very, very proud to sit behind the sign of the United States. And I believe that the United States is the indispensable nation. But there is nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It just means that we need to be engaged. And Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables. It ends in an ism. But all it means is partnership. So, and I also think that the world doesn't operate well without the United States. And I just had a very visible example of that. I went to I was in Marrakesh, in Morocco for a meeting, and I went to a conference, a UN immigration conference. It was being run by a Canadian, Louise Arbour, and she invited me to come and speak from the dais. And I look out, the Russians and Chinese are there, the American seat is empty. And I think that when we withdraw, then there are others who will fill the vacuum, and that is what's going on. And I think the discussion we need to have now is, what is America's position in the 21st century? Americans don't want to be the world's policeman, but I think if we're out of it completely, we're AWOL, we have really undermined the position, and people depend on us. There's just no question. I think there are a lot of us, you've been to many meetings, you're very active, many people here are, and when the U.S. is not there, I can assure you that nothing happens. But that doesn't mean bullying our allies. By the way, I don't know how many people have read about this, but there's this conference in Munich, the Munich Security Conference, and we've always been kind of the center of discussion. This year it was really bad because we were it was an embarrassment, and fortunately, 50 members of Congress went, which leads me to say, I happen to believe that in many ways, it's Article 1 time, which is why I was very glad to be on the Hill yesterday, and to really be engaged in a very good discussion with the members of the committees and the caucuses, and to spend time talking about how, for me, executive-legislative relations are the most interesting part of our government. And so I love doing that. And by the way, it was one of the things I say to my students is that every country makes foreign policy decisions based on 5 factors. and it's worth knowing them. So the first one is objective. Where is the country? Most countries don't change their geographical location. Russia did. And we have changed our resource base with the whole oil and fracking. Then the second one is subjective. How do the people feel about things? That's much harder to measure. And you were talking about Bush and Obama. Is Obama felt that we were in too many countries and was pulling people back. And so there's no question that one administration reacts to another. The third one is how the government is set up, and in our case, executive-legislative relations. The fourth one are bureaucratic politics, which are reflected mostly in how the budget looks in the end. And the fifth one is the role of individuals. And in order to really understand foreign policy, you need to do the 5 factors for yourself and also for the other country. And I do think we need to think more about what the basis of foreign policy is, but mostly I think we need to figure out what America's role in the world is at this point. And it's not one that promotes democracy or, to a great extent, is problem solving. We cannot be AWOL.
So there's going to be a... We're going to have a test for everybody in a little bit, and Albright's 5 factors of foreign policy. I'm going to open it up for questions pretty soon, but before I do that, so you can start thinking about your questions, but before I do that, I want to ask you a more personal question about your life as a public servant. You know, you've had many accomplishments. There have been some really difficult choices you've had to make, some that still haunt you, I'm sure. How do you reflect on this life of public service, and what, if anything, would you say to young university students about a life like that? And do you have any advice for them?
Well, first of all, I loved being a public servant, and I think there's no greater privilege than being a public servant. I went through many different iterations of who I was going to be. By the way, the thing that I do say to students, there is no way to plan out your life totally.
Amen.
There really
I
is
still
not.
don't know what I want to
No,
be.
but what happened was I wanted to be a journalist. And I was on my college paper, and I did all the things, and we were having dinner with my former husband's managing editor, and he looks at me and he says, "So what are you going to do, honey?" I said, "I'm going to be a journalist." And he said, "I don't think so. You can't be on the same paper as your husband because of labor regulations." And even though there were 3 other papers in Chicago at the time, and he said, "You wouldn't want to compete with your husband, so go find something else to do."
Honey.
So, I can't believe I did this, nor would any young person in the audience do this now. I agreed. I went to work for Encyclopedia Britannica, which, by the way, is a book.
Or many books.
Yeah, I did some work there, and then I got pregnant with twins, and then my twins were born early. I had always wanted to learn Russian, but because I'm Czech, taking first-year Russian at college would have been too easy, but I couldn't take second-year Russian because I didn't know the alphabet. So my twins were born early. I had to leave them in the incubators in the hospital, so I took Russian for 8 hours a day for 8 weeks, and that made me decide I wanted to go to graduate school. So it took me forever to get my degree, which is when I got involved in politics. I won't go through the whole thing, but one thing led to another, and that combination of things. By the way, be nice to your professors, because Zbigniew Brzezinski was my professor, and he then hired me. So, the combination, I have loved politics, and I love public service. But I think the main thing is people need to do something that they want to do, that they're passionate about and are curious about. And then mainly, I say this to everybody, you have to deliver. You can't have a job and say, "I don't like it today," if you are responsible. And I really do think public service is a great, great way to contribute to democracy. So I hope people think about it. I have no regrets. By the way, I could have happily been Secretary of State forever, but they didn't need me.
Thank you so much for that. So now we're going to turn to the audience for some questions, and we're going to alternate between the orchestra and the balcony. And the way to indicate whether you would like to ask a question is the old-fashioned hand raising, and somebody will come to your assistance with a microphone. And I believe we have a question somewhere down here to begin with. Please identify yourself. Thank you. This is a 19th century technology.
Thank you for being here, Madam Secretary. My name is Gianna Giordano. I'm a senior studying public policy here. And something that you emphasized is the importance of us learning how to engage with people who we disagree with. And I was actually having a conversation with one of my friends about that this morning, and something that we were grappling with is how difficult it can be to be in a disagreement with someone when your position on an issue just feels so deeply personal, and especially when it comes from your own lived experience or the lived experience of someone who you care about. So my question is, how do you personally engage with people who you disagree with when your position on an issue feels so personal and emotional?
Well, it's not easy, frankly, but I think that the main part is to understand that it probably is the same thing for the other person, and try to be empathetic. It is not easy. I had to learn. There are plenty of people that I really disagree with, but I want to know what it is that makes them take the decision that they have. And I figure that there is something in their history, background, etc., that makes them think the way they do. And the worst part is to be condescending about it, I think, and just dismissive of it. But it is essential. And I do, today I actually tried, and I was at the airport, so it didn't exactly work, but two women came up to me. They had Trump buttons on, and I wanted to know why they wanted their picture with me. And, you know, we started talking, and I thought I would really like to spend some time trying to figure out what is it that makes people do what they do. And I think it's worth trying to figure it out. But there is no way to say it's easy. And the main thing is not to get mad, I think, and be dismissive. But it is not easy. In many ways, it's easier when you don't know the people. If it's a member of your family, it's a little harder. And that is something that does happen.
Thank you. And let's go to the balcony. It's a little hard to see, but it's the voice of God up there somewhere.
There are people up there,
Yes.
right?
Do we have a question lined up there?
Yes, sorry, I did
Perfect.
part of the way down. Hi, my name is Lee Eford. I'm actually not a student here. I'm a student, Chapel Hill. Sorry, y'all.
Maybe you should talk to this young woman down here.
I think we all talked about a week ago. I shouldn't have said that. Okay.
This is about engaging with differences.
Exactly. I'm actually a dual degree, Master's of Social Work, Master's of Public Administration student at UNC Chapel Hill. And I was wondering, how do we square the idea of promoting democracy in all sorts of other countries with the history of the United States is colonialism and imperialism and our global image of being imperialist in the past? And how do we encourage democracy without worsening that global image?
Yeah. I think part of the thing, and I'm going to talk about the experience of the National Democratic Institute for that very reason. As I said, we started in the middle 80s, and we're trying to figure out what to do. And one of the first things that we did was you have to have partners in the countries where you are working, people that are looking for help in terms of the nuts and bolts of democracy. So we started in Chile with the Pinochet campaign, and then what happened was all of a sudden, after the end of the Cold War, in Central and Eastern Europe, and we would say it's not just American democracy. We would take the people with us that we'd worked with in Chile and then go into various countries in Central Europe. Now, we take countries from Central Europe to go into the Middle East or something. So it isn't an American imperialist democracy. It is democracy with the help of others. And I do think that for the most part, Americans, I mean, they don't want to be policemen. I do think there are some places where, and this is one of the issues now about Venezuela, what our history is in the Western Hemisphere, but I do think that we need to do democracy in partnership with other democracies and not just have it be the American form of democracy.
Let's go back down to the orchestra.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm studying political science and civic engagement and social change. And I'm wondering what advice you have for young women going into male-dominated fields to stake out a claim for themselves and find mentors.
Well, let me just say, I think that, I'm often asked what it would, I do think women, I have talked about this so many times in terms of the importance of societies, especially democratic societies, to have women politically and economically empowered. It's just stronger and using, and in most countries, most women are more than half the population, so it's like not using a good resource. I think that it is very important to have confidence in yourself and not always say, I can't do that. You can do anything you put your mind to. And frankly, it's less and less dominated. By the way, I was the first woman Secretary of State, but my granddaughter, my youngest granddaughter, when she was 7, 8 years ago, said, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State, and that was true at that point with Condi and Hillary. And then a lot of little boys became, encouraged by the fact that a man could be Secretary of State. So things do change. But I also do think we need to help each other. And the most famous thing I ever said, it ended up on Starbucks cups, was that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other. And I got that out of my own experience, because during this period when I was getting my PhD and my twins, other women would say to me, why aren't you in the carpool line? That would be more valuable. Or my hollandaise sauce is so much better than yours. And we're very judgmental about each other. So I think we need to be more helpful to each other in all of this and have confidence in ourselves. And then I bet pretty much every woman in the room can identify with the fact of being in a meeting and you're the only woman and you think to yourself, well, I'd like to say something, and then you think, no, everybody will think it's stupid. And then some man says it and everybody thinks it's brilliant and you're very mad at yourself. And so I made up a rule, I made up an educational term, which probably doesn't exist, which is active listening. Always be prepared to interrupt. And so my motto for every woman is...
What is it? You were going to say what?
Absolutely, always. Yeah. But we don't do that. So when I started teaching right after that, I said that nobody in class could raise their hands. They just had to interrupt, which meant my classes were a bit of a zoo. But I do think that's important. The other part, without insulting half the people in this audience, there is plenty of room in the world for mediocre men. There is no room for mediocre women. And you just have to prepare yourself to work twice as hard. But then, I am often asked if the world would be better off if it were only run by women. If you think that, you've forgotten high school. So what you want is to have all of us working together.
It was too bad you didn't hit your stride on this one. All right, I think we're back in the balcony. Yes?
Thank you. Madam Secretary, two things. One has to do with your encounter in the airport with the two women. It seems to me that would be an example of really two worldviews. On the one hand, someone interested in promoting dialogue, thinking, understanding. On the other side, we had an appreciation of celebrity and charisma. And of course, you're a great example of a charismatic person. And maybe that's what they were drawn to. So I'm just curious if you don't think that there's an enormous gap between those two points of view. That was one thing. But the other is I'd be interested in your opinion of the work and the influence of one of your predecessors, Henry Kissinger. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I do, I now figured out that people just like to take selfies, but whatever. By the way, you're not going to believe this, but things have gotten fairly crazy, so that even later I went to the bathroom and somebody said, "What are you doing here?" And I said the same thing you are. So, but Henry Kissinger, let me just say this, is Henry Kissinger was the first person to call me when I was named Secretary of State. And he said, "Madeleine, you have taken away my one unique characteristic of being an immigrant Secretary of State." And I said, "No, Henry, I don't have an accent." And then he welcomed me to the fraternity, and I said, "Guess what? It's not a fraternity anymore." I think Henry Kissinger is one of the most interesting thinkers and somebody that has contributed an incredible amount to American foreign policy. I haven't agreed with everything that he has done, but he is somebody that is very thoughtful and has a theory in many ways and thinks about the role of the United States, and I do wish that we were doing that a little bit more. Something you might want to know is that there has been a very good relationship of former secretaries of state. It's not a very large club, and until recently, we all spent a lot of time together. And I think that there is value in having that kind of relationship, and whether it's with Henry Kissinger or George Shultz or Colin Powell, and it's been very good. But I'm going to answer this, and you probably have heard of the television show, Madam Secretary. And what happened was that in the opening of this season, Colin Powell and Hillary Clinton and I were invited to do it, and the whole thing was completely scripted, except that I got an unscripted line in, which was that there's been some horror at the White House, and Taya Leone calls us all in, and I said, "Isn't it nice when the current Secretary of State calls her predecessors in to consult? We used to do it all the time."
The orchestra over here.
Thank you. Camille Berry, Wellesley College, class of 91.
1959.
Yes, we know. Also, Golden class. I'm here with about 30 sisters. We came out to see you. We're so grateful and we're so proud to have you here with us. But what I'd like to talk about is our motto, our college motto is non ministrare, and I might butcher this, non ministrare sed ministrare, not to be served, but to serve. And that truly is your life's example. And on this most recent issue of our magazine, Wellesley Runs, and there are a lot of women who have been called to action, who are running for office. My question is, there are some of us who don't wish to run. We wish to serve as citizens, and I'd like to hear more about how we can do that and be effective, because those who are in office need those of us who are not to make change happen. And if you could speak to that, that would be wonderful.
By the way, we translated it not to be ministers, but to be ministers' wives. But that was in the dark ages. I went to Wellesley sometime between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. So I do think the following thing, and in my to-do list, it's not just for people to run for office, but others to be active in terms of it doesn't do any good to just be in office and not have a relationship with the people that you represent, and the people that you represent are the ones that in many ways are out there carrying out what needs to be done, understanding what their neighbors want, trying to figure out how to solve problems. So I think it is a very important relationship, and I believe when I say people need to be politically active, it doesn't mean just running for office, but in fact doing exactly what you're talking about, of being a citizen is a responsibility. It is not free. And what happens is in countries where citizens have been disrespected, the things don't work. And citizenship, I think we need to take more seriously. I had a conversation today, and I hate to be critical of this, but our high schools need to talk more about citizenship and civics and how the Constitution is constructed. And that begins by really understanding the role of being a citizen. It is the highest honor to be a citizen.
Orchestra?
Okay. Hi, my name is Diridona. I am from Kosovo. I would like to thank you, Dr. Albright, on my name and on my country's name for what you and this country has done for us. Yeah, if it wasn't for you and for America and America's intervention through NATO in Kosovo's war, I don't know if I would be alive and standing here today, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to say, people often ask me what is the thing I'm proudest of, and it is Kosovo, because I do believe that we do have a responsibility for each other. And when in Kosovo people were being ethnically cleansed, raped, or killed for what they believed in, not anything they had done, it was not commensurate with American values. But I do have to tell you, it was not a simple operation. The Secretary of State can say whatever, but has no airplanes. And then when the fighting started, everything went wrong. The weather was bad, the Serbs put out decoys. Then I come into my office one morning and my executive assistant says, "Sit down." I said, "What?" He said, "Just sit down." I said, "What is the matter with you?" He said, "We've just bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake." And so everything was going wrong. It was called Madeleine's War. And then when it went right, other people took some credit. But I have to say, that I love going to Kosovo, and there's a whole generation of little girls whose first name is Madeleine, and so I'm going there in June to celebrate the independence of Kosovo.
And now what is indeed the orchestra, which is down here. Yes, next question.
Hi, Madeleine. I'm Mac, freshman here. And I'm curious about what advice you can give to the future leaders in this room who will have to make decisions or who have to deal with a populace that votes like out of fear and emotion that's influenced by like misinformation.
I didn't fully...
What advice can you give, given that we have a population or people who vote out of fear and emotion rather than
I have
rational?
to tell you, it's interesting because the thing that bothers me the most is motivating people by the fear factor. And it isn't just fear of events, but fear of each other. And then finding, when I go back to my definition of authoritarian fascist governments, is basically when you decide that the other is your enemy and a scapegoat. And that is operating on the basis of the fear factor. And I think what we have to do, especially as Americans, is the hope factor. I think we really have to operate on that. One of the things, by the way, just to connect all the looniness of my life, is that I do travel a lot, and I'm going to the Czech Republic next week, and it's the anniversary of when we brought them into NATO. I went there in order to give the speech, and as I get off the stage, the Prime Minister says to me, "Only an American could deliver a speech like that because you're so optimistic." And I do think that that is a mark of an American in terms of optimism and hope, and not the fear factor, which is why I am troubled by certain aspects of things that are going on now, to be afraid of people coming from Latin America to build walls, to declare emergencies. We cannot operate only on the fear factor. I think we are a country of hope.
Let's go to the balcony.
Hi, Secretary Albright. My name's Stephanie, and I'm a junior studying political science and human rights here at Duke. So I'm in a class right now where we talk a lot about the rise of partisanship in American news and kind of how that affects what kind of information different American gets and then, their beliefs and therefore political actions after that. So I was wondering, as you talked about how news and information is so important to democracy, what are your thoughts on this? And is there a solution as, this is growing to a huge loss of American faith in media and therefore institutions as a whole?
I have been particularly interested, mainly, as I said, I had wanted to be a journalist, and I was trying to combine that with my love of political science and history. And so I wrote my dissertation because I'm interested in the role of the press in political change. So I wrote my dissertation about the Czechoslovak press in 1968, the Prague Spring. And then I wrote a book about the Polish press during the Solidarity period. So I spent a lot of my time in life thinking about the role of information and the press. And what is interesting that was true under communism was that the people knew the truth. They had learned it, some from the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, some from information that they exchanged, and the official press was censored and lied. The opposite is happening in a number of places now, Egypt, for instance, where the people have been motivated, as I said earlier, by their own echo chamber to go to Tahrir Square, and they don't know the truth. And the people that are disseminating the truth are some journalists who are being arrested. And so it's interesting to kind of look at what people know or they don't know and where they get their news. I think it's extremely hard at the moment, and I don't want to sound like a relativist, to know exactly what the truth is. So what you have to do is to look at a lot of different sources of information and compare. I read every morning, I read the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times. And it's important to kind of find out how they view stories differently. I listen to MSNBC and CNN and Fox. By the way, the important part is to listen to things you disagree with. You should be very glad you don't live in Washington, because as I drive, I listen to right-wing radio, and I get a little excited. So, but I do think it's important, very important, to listen to different things, and you have to get your sources from a lot of different information. It is not easy. Now, I was asked the other day, actually during the hearing, whether I thought that whether the press needed to, and especially cable news, needed to have some kind of better sense about what they put on all the time. And I really do think, I am worried about the way that a lot of our news is motivated by ratings. And so the question is, who is doing the right thing? It is not simple. It is definitely not easy. And the only way at this point is to look at multiple sources, recognize what the source of it is, understand that there is there's such a thing as Russia Today and various propaganda activities, and it's not simple. Very different than in the era where some of us grew up, where there were 3 major channels and you trusted what they said at night. It is not like that. You have to do comparison.
I think we have a question over here.
My name is Melissa Boyette, and I'm an activist, as well as I have a ministry in which I'm trying to declare Jubilee. I went to prison on the 4th of July, 2015, for trying to bring the Confederate flag to half-mast after 9 Christians died in the Charleston massacre. And in all honesty, the music has been following me around ever since then, leading me, and the trumpets have been sounding. Like a game show host with a departing gift, I could not believe my ears. The tables have turned with Demi Lovato, Walking on Water, 30 Minutes to Mars, Last of the Real Ones, Fall Out Boys. The music goes on and on and on. And I honestly believe that Donald Trump is a publicity stunt.
Can we get, I want to get to a question here, please.
The question is, which party is helping the marginalized population now? Would it be President Obama and Rachel Maddow, who told me to go get the flag down and know that he's a publicity stunt? Or would it be the Donald Trump who's in office now, who is obviously a fascist?
I think that we as citizens need to express our views. I think that I don't know what are publicity stunts. I do know that we as Americans have a right to express our views, to respect each other's views, and not to demonize the other, but to try to figure out how to operate on the basis of hope and not hate.
Let's go to the balcony.
Hi, my name is Ashka. I'm a senior studying computer science and statistics. I wanted to ask, who are those in your personal and or professional spheres who have impacted you the most?
Who are the persons in your professional and personal sphere who have impacted your life the most?
Well, I do have to say, obviously my parents, but especially what I find interesting in them was that they were dedicated to the country where they were born, Czechoslovakia, which was then taken away from them twice, first by the Nazis and then by the communists. And then they came to America bravely in order to get a better life. And the part, they had many different sayings, but my father had a huge influence on me. And what he said when he came to the United States, he was grateful to be here. And by the way, we spent the war in England. And what happened was that he used to say this, when we were in England during the war, people were very kind. They would say, "We're so sorry, your country's been taken over by a terrible dictator. You're welcome here. How can we do to help you? And when are you going home?" When we came to the United States, people said, "We're so sorry, your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when will you become a citizen?" And my father said, that is what made America different from every other country, and I believe that. I do think the people that have had an influence on me actually were my professors at Wellesley, and some fabulous ones, but mostly the people that I've worked with in so many ways, in different ways. There were not a lot of female mentors. I didn't know Eleanor Roosevelt, but I really do think that we need to help each other, and you never know where your influence comes from. So, and the people that have kept me down to earth are my daughters and my grandchildren. So I look for help everywhere, and even from the people that come up and ask to have their picture taken with me.
Over here.
Hello, Madam Secretary. My name's Ibrahim Butt. I'm a junior here studying political science and human rights. I'm actually from Blackburn, England. So my question was referring to England. I do hope my country now does treat individuals fleeing persecution better. But with Brexit, who knows? My question refers to conflict abroad. My parents are from Pakistan, and especially with what is going on right now with India and Pakistan, I was, going through Politico, and they have an article that says South Asia will be the newest conflict region in the world, and that democracy is under threat there. Where do you see around the world, which areas of the world do you see democracy under threat, and why is democracy under threat there?
I actually do see democracy under threat everywhere, frankly, mainly because there really are issues about first of all, democracy delivering, as I said earlier, and the extent to which we help each other, and then real questions about how the social contract is being carried out in different places. And I do think we are living in a completely different era, and we haven't worked out the institutional basis for things. And this is why the kind of work that you're doing, democracy help and assistance, but there's a somewhat different problem everywhere. And I do hope, when we're talking about service and all of you as students, that you decide that you don't just have to be active in the United States. Some of you here are foreign students, and the networks that are created in terms of, by the way, I know this isn't fair, but my generation has screwed everything up, and so therefore we are counting on you to develop this new system and to kind of think about what it is you appreciate about democracy, what you understand in terms of the needs of your own society, and whether you're politically active by running or doing support system that is so important. But I do think we're in a new era. And the various, I've said often that institutions and people at age 70 need refurbishing. And there definitely is a lot of work that needs to be done. And I do think that democracy is under threat in a number of places. I do think technology and the question about where people get their news, any number of different things are out there. And by the way, it isn't just democracy that's under threat. The planet is under threat from climate change.
Is that a fact?
That is a fact.
Okay.
Yes, and the earth isn't flat, you know?
Okay. I think there may be somebody in the balcony. Are there questions in the balcony? Yes, go.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a junior studying English. I'm sure you know that this is the 25th anniversary since the Rwandan genocide, so I was wondering how you reconcile perhaps points in your career where maybe there was conflict, and also what you believe the U.S.'s position is today in preventing atrocities occurring today.
So, Madam, I think the question here is about when the United States has to use or has chosen to use force that does harm, and when the United States potentially has been involved in atrocities. Or
Rwanda.
Or, yeah.
All right, so
Okay.
let me try to, this is going to take me a while. Let me say the following thing, is that it's very easy to judge decisions later because there's more information that comes out that may not be available to people at the time they're making the decisions. And when I teach class, I kind of have Madeleine's verities. And one of them is that the first information that comes in is always wrong, and that you have to deal with the information that you have, and you have to also consider what are the other things taking place at the time. So this is something that the Rwanda situation weighs very heavily on all our minds and hearts and souls. President Clinton asked for a review, I can't tell you how many times, as to what happened. So just to kind of go through what the situation was. When, in 1993, when I got to the UN, there really were many more possibilities for what peacekeeping operations could do as a result of a lot of the work that the first President Bush had done in terms of coalition building and the possibilities of having United Nations action. There really were, we were looking for a variety of ways of using peacekeeping operations. So, and it was the Bush administration that actually started during the transition the feeding operations in Somalia that then the Clinton administration picked up, and it was very important. And we were trying to do some things in Bosnia. There were problems in Haiti, and the ship that we sent over was turned around. And then the thing that happened in Somalia was Black Hawk Down, and Americans were killed and dragged through the streets, and there were demonstrations about not using force abroad. Then what happened was at the Security Council at the UN, every day somebody would come in from representative of the Secretary General to describe all the horrors that were going on in the world. Rwanda was on the Security Council as a member and denied everything. Boutros Ghali didn't want to go in it. I mean, there were any number of different issues. My instructions were to make sure we didn't add any more peacekeepers. The bottom line is that there was volcanic genocide in Rwanda. The plane of the president was shot down, and it was volcanic. And it happened so quickly that even if we could have gotten there, even if we decided to go, we could not have gotten there in time. There has been rolling genocide in Darfur, and we have not done something about it. But you just have to know there were the action in terms of not wanting us to do anything, the fact that things had gone wrong in Somalia and Haiti, and we didn't have all the facts. It's a horror show. It is more embarrassed than any of us can tell you, and we should have done something. I went to Rwanda afterwards, and it was horrible to be there, but it was horrible. We were not responsible for the atrocities, but the situation was not as clear as it appeared at the time. And the question that I think we all have now is where should we be? Where do we go? Do Americans want to be part of the peacekeeping operations? What are we going to do? When is America involved? And if we aren't involved, it's a damned if you do or damned if you don't. And it's a very difficult decision. And if you ever are in office on this, these are the kinds of decisions that are incredibly hard to make. And you don't always have the right information. And all of us bear on our souls what we didn't do in Rwanda.
So as we're closing in on the hour, I'm going to just gather some of the remaining questions on the floor, if you can be succinct, and then we'll
And I'll try to be succinct.
Yeah. So I think we've got, I see 2 questions here in the balcony. I don't know if there's one in the orchestra. Let's try to gather them.
Hi, Madam Secretary. My name is Robin, and I will actually be a freshman at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown this fall. So hopefully I'll be taking one of your classes. I wanted to frame my question in light of China and its valuable relationship with the United States economically, but there have been concerns of China's treatment of minorities such as the Uyghurs as well as human rights activists. With this in mind, how should the United States balance preserving valuable economic and diplomatic relations, especially with such a growing power, while keeping accountable democratic and human rights around the world?
Thank you. Let's take over here.
Hi, Madam Secretary. My name is Margot, and I work in communications for Planned Parenthood. My question is, how do you keep the big picture in mind when there's literally a daily assault on our values and our rights? And I mean every day. I also want to know about your experience working on Parks and Rec and what your next acting move is.
Yes. So that was 2 questions. Is there one question in the balcony?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi. My name is Ash. I'm an undergrad here. One thing I learned about, I don't know if I learned this, but one thing we talked about in class was how, by definition, democracy can't really come about democratically. And I was wondering what you believe the U.S.'s role should be in aiding the coming about of democracies in other nations, whether that be through revolution or regime change or something like that.
All right, so I think we've covered the last one. So there's democracy and economic interests, human rights and economic interests, and then...
Well, let me just say, on the China issue, but not the only country that has a bad human rights record, I can tell you a lot depends on how we see ourselves. And I can just tell you that in the administrations that I worked in, we spent a lot of time on human rights. And there was not a time that I didn't go into a country and make very clear, no matter what, you always go in with a set of talking points about the things that you need from the country. And they go from any number of different things, but I can assure you, we always talked about human rights and made very clear what our needs were about that and the needs of the people, and said that both publicly often and sometimes even more strongly privately. But it doesn't mean that you don't deal with the country. And I think one of the things that we have to learn is that, as I said earlier, you have to deal with the pragmatic situation, and you have to tell it like it is, but at the same time, you have to be able to work out something. I have a new thing that I am pushing, and that is that I think it is a mistake when we don't have diplomatic relations with a country. It doesn't mean we approve of them, but we need people there. We needed, and when we need somebody in North Korea to tell us what's going on. We need somebody in Iran, and we punish ourselves when we don't have diplomatic representation there to know what's happening. Diplomats are the eyes and ears and the spokespeople for our value system. So that, you know.
And there was a question over here about how do you keep the big picture in mind?
Well, I think that is, first of all, I do think it's very important to remember and what our goal is as a country. As I said, I don't think we're an imperialist country. I really don't. I honestly am a very grateful American and was proud to represent the United States. And the big picture is that you have to take one step at a time and remember who we are and what we need and what our actions, how they affect others. And I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And so, but it's that worrying that makes me want to be a problem solver. And so, anyway, I do have a whole television career. And it started out with Gilmore Girls. And then Parks and Rec and Madam Secretary. So I just have this whole other life you just don't know about.
Wonderful.
Yeah. But can I tell one more? Something that happened is things you never expect. I became secretary, and I was told all of a sudden that I had to go to the ASEAN Regional Forum, and that it was customary for at the last dinner for every country to put on a skit, and the United States did very badly. And so I said, I'm not going, and they said, you have to go. So I go, and the State Department gives me lyrics to Mary Had a Little Lamb, and I said, I am not doing this. And on the way over, I decided, with the help of my delegation, that I would sing Don't Cry for Me, ASEANis. I got dressed up as Madonna, and I did that. And then the following year, I did a duet with the Russians, and we did our version of the West Side Story, which was the East-West story. I came out singing, this was with Primakov, Yevgeny, Yevgeny, the most beautiful sound I ever heard. And Primakov came out singing Madeleine Albright, Madeleine Albright. So you have to have a little bit of fun, and that is what keeps me going.
Well, we
Yeah.
We clearly picked the wrong title for today's talk, because we should have just picked like show tunes or something.
Or something, right?
Anyhow, a couple of days ago, you were sitting next to Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former Danish Prime Minister and former Secretary of NATO. And being a good fellow Dane, he called me after the session, and he said, Judith, Secretary Albright told me she's coming down to Duke, and she was very, very distressed because, as you yourself mentioned, she didn't have a Blue Devil pin. Yeah. So I want to make sure that you have a Blue pin.
Love it. Great.
It's the same as this one here.
Yeah, great.
It's
Lovely.
like that
Wonderful.
one. So you don't need to unwrap it. You've said a while ago that it took you a while to find your voice, but now that you've found it, you're not going to be silent. And you have not been silent tonight. And we have been the fortunate recipients of being able to listen to your voice. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for your kindness and hospitality.